She jotted a note before asking, "Has Alma ever asked for changes in medication or insisted on handling them without your involvement?" This time Noah spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Yes, she preferred to manage it herself. She said it kept things organized." Jennings gave a small nod, then turned to the nurse outside the room. "Please bring in Ms. Mensah." Moments later, Alma entered. She wore a simple navy dress with a light cardigan, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her expression carried a mix of concern and composure, far calmer than the Wallace brothers expected. Jennings gestured for her to sit. "Ms. Mensah, thank you for speaking with us. Could you describe your role in Mr. Wallace's care?" Alma's Ghanaian accent was gentle but clear. "Yes, Detective. I have been with Mr. Wallace for 8 months now. I prepare his meals, keep the house in order, and make sure he takes his medicine on time. His health has not been easy, but I do everything I can." Jennings leaned forward slightly. "Your patient's blood work shows sedatives in his system, strong ones. Can you explain how those might have been introduced?" Alma's eyes widened briefly, just enough to register surprise, but she quickly composed herself. "I do not know about this. I only give him what is prescribed. I never, ever add anything else. I care for him as if he were my own father." Her voice carried a conviction that momentarily unsettled even Tyler, who had been ready to confront her. But Jennings wasn't swayed so easily. "So you're saying you had no knowledge of these sedatives, and you never requested them from a doctor or pharmacy?" Alma shook her head firmly. "No, Detective, never. If there are strange medicines in his body, they did not come from me." The silence in the room was thick. Jennings studied her face, searching for cracks in her calm exterior. There were none. When the detective finally stood, she spoke evenly. "Thank you, Miss Mensah. That will be all for tonight. But I want you available for follow-up questions. This isn't the end of it." As Alma left the room, the brothers exchanged uneasy looks. To them, her words had sounded rehearsed, almost too perfect. But to the detective, the case was only beginning, and every person in Richard Wallace's orbit was now a potential suspect. At 6:15 the next morning, October 6th, the hospital ward was quiet, except for the beeping of monitors and the shuffle of nurses on their early rounds. Inside room 214, Richard Wallace stirred. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his eyelids twitching before finally fluttering open. For the first time in nearly 12 hours, he was awake. Tyler, who had stayed overnight in a stiff plastic chair beside the bed, immediately leaned forward. His heart raced at the sight of his father's eyes moving. Dad, it's me, Tyler. Can you hear me?" Richard's lips moved, but no sound came. His throat was dry, and his body weak from the medication that still lingered in his system. He tried again, his voice no stronger than a whisper. "Not right." Tyler grabbed his hand. "What's not right? Tell me, Dad." The monitor beeped faster as Richard fought to form the words. He turned his head slightly, eyes darting toward the doorway. Logan and Noah entered at that moment, rushing to the bedside. Logan's voice trembled. "Dad, we're here. It's okay, just rest." But Richard shook his head faintly, his voice straining as if every syllable cost him energy. "She gave me wrong pills." All three brothers froze. The weight of his unfinished sentence hung in the air. Tyler's voice cracked with anger. "You heard him. He said she. He's talking about Alma. He tried to warn us, and now look what's happened." Logan rubbed his face with both hands, torn between frustration and doubt. "But he didn't finish." He couldn't even say her name. What if we're assuming too much? Noah glanced toward the hallway, his stomach tight. Doesn't matter. We have to tell Detective Jennings exactly what he said. If Dad's pointing at her, she needs to be investigated right now. Outside the room, a nurse had overheard enough of the exchange to call the detective's office. By noon, Jennings was back at the hospital, notebook in hand, ready to record every detail of Richard Wallace's attempt to speak. For the first time, the case no longer rested only on suspicion. Now the victim himself had spoken, even if only in fragments. And those fragments were enough to turn suspicion into full-scale investigation. Detective Jennings knew that in cases like this, the smallest detail could mean the difference between truth and assumption. Richard Wallace's whispered words had introduced a new urgency. The detective wasn't ready to make an arrest, but the father's strained warning was enough to justify digging deeper into Alma Mensa's past. That afternoon, Jennings requested her employment records. At first glance, Alma appeared clean. She had been in the United States for nearly 10 years, originally entering on a student visa from Ghana. After completing courses in nursing assistance, she shifted into home care work, moving from family to family as a private caregiver. Her resume looked polished, too polished. Every reference was glowing, every timeline exact. But Jennings had worked enough fraud cases to know when something looked too perfect. He started making phone calls. The first number, listed as a previous employer, belonged to a disconnected line. The second reached a woman in Pennsylvania who hesitated before confirming anything. After a few minutes of gentle pressure, she admitted the truth. Yes, Alma had worked for her father, but she left suddenly after an incident with his medications. The woman refused to go into detail, but her words were enough to plant seeds of suspicion. Jennings wrote in his notes, "Pattern, medication mishandling. Look for repetition." Back in Ohio, the Wallace brothers were restless. Tyler was the loudest, pacing the hospital waiting area, his jaw tight. "She's dangerous. Dad said it himself. We shouldn't even wait for the detective. She needs to be out of our house for good." Logan, ever the mediator, shook his head. "We can't just throw accusations around. If we're wrong and Alma's innocent, we'll regret it. We need facts, not just fear." Noah sat quietly in the corner, his arms folded. His silence carried more weight than words. When he finally spoke, it was with a low intensity. "You both heard him. Dad pointed at her. That's not nothing. But we need to let Jennings finish his job. If Alma really did this, the truth will come out." Meanwhile, Alma continued her work at the Wallace home, seemingly unbothered. She cooked, cleaned, and kept her routine steady. To neighbors and casual visitors, she looked like the picture of loyalty and care. But inside the Wallace family, suspicion was tightening like a knot. Jennings pressed further. He contacted another family in Chicago who had once employed Alma. Their story was nearly identical. An elderly man whose health declined rapidly under her care. Nothing criminal had ever been proven, but the daughter recalled filing a quiet complaint with the agency that placed Alma. 2 families, 2 warnings, and now, potentially a third. For Jennings, the pieces were starting to align, but suspicion alone wasn't enough. He needed evidence, proof that the pills Richard Wallace claimed were wrong had in fact been tampered with. The detective ordered a full toxicology test on Richard's blood. Results would take days, maybe longer. Until then, the Wallace family was left to sit with their unease, watching a woman they no longer trusted move freely through their father's home. What had begun as a desperate hire to help an aging father was now unraveling into a web of doubt, fear, and unanswered questions. The case was no longer just about care. It was about trust.
and what happens when trust turns fatal.
The days after Richard Wallace's collapse moved slowly. Each sunrise stretched longer than the last, the Wallace brothers living in a constant state of unease. They knew Detective Jennings had ordered toxicology tests, but waiting for results felt unbearable, especially while Amma Mensah still came and went as though nothing had changed. Tyler was the most restless. He started stopping by the house at random hours, sometimes showing up late at night just to check things over. Logan tried to calm him down, warning that his paranoia could drive Amma away before they had proof. But Noah said little. He kept watch in his own quiet way, lingering longer than usual when Amma prepared their father's meals or laid out his medications. Amma, for her part, behaved exactly as she always had. She smiled politely, cooked hearty stews, and reminded the brothers to rest. If she noticed the tension around her, she gave no sign. But inside the Wallace home, suspicion thickened. One evening, as rain streaked the windows, Tyler cornered Logan in the kitchen. "This isn't right, man. She's still here, still feeding him, still handling his pills. What if she's finishing what she started?" Logan rubbed his temples. "And what if she's not? You heard Jennings. Without evidence, we can't act. If we fire her now, she'll vanish. We'll never know the truth." Noah finally spoke from the doorway, his tone firm. "We don't touch her, not yet, but nobody leaves Dad alone with her, not for 1 second." And so the brothers formed an uneasy pact. At least one of them would always be in the house, watching. But Jennings wasn't just sitting idle. He had investigators quietly combing through Amma's financial records. What they uncovered was puzzling. Despite working modest caregiving jobs, her bank account showed regular wire transfers, thousands of dollars moving overseas to Ghana. Where was that money coming from? Jennings filed the discovery under suspicious activity, adding to his growing stack of notes. Then, 4 days after Richard Wallace was admitted to the hospital, the toxicology report finally arrived. Jennings opened it carefully, scanning each line. The results were unmistakable. Richard's bloodstream carried traces of a powerful sedative, one not prescribed to him, a sedative that in high doses could cause confusion, slurred speech, and eventually cardiac arrest. For Jennings, this was the break he needed. Someone had introduced foreign medication into Richard Wallace's system, and the person with the most access, the one preparing his meals, organizing his pills, and standing by his bedside, was Amma Mensah. But one question remained. Was it deliberate, or was it a deadly mistake?
On October 20th, 2 weeks after Richard Wallace's collapse, Detective Jennings decided it was time to confront the caregiver who had become the center of his investigation. He didn't storm the house with handcuffs. Instead, he chose a quieter approach, one that would test her reactions before making an arrest. Jennings asked Amma Mensah to come down to the station for a routine follow-up. She agreed without hesitation, arriving in the same calm, deliberate way she always carried herself. To the casual eye, she looked like any other caregiver being questioned about a medical emergency. Inside the interview room, Jennings placed the toxicology report on the table. "Mrs. Mensah," he began, his tone measured, "tests show that Mr. Wallace had a sedative in his system, a drug that wasn't prescribed to him. Can you explain how that happened?" Amma looked down at her folded hands. "I don't know about that. I only gave him the medications his doctor ordered." Jennings leaned forward. "You were the one cooking his meals, organizing his pills, caring for him daily. If this drug got into his system, it almost certainly came from you." Amma's eyes flickered, but she stayed composed. "Detective, I would never hurt him. I came to this country to help families, not to poison them." Narrator, the silence hung heavy in the room. He watched her body language, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers drummed softly against the table. He had interviewed enough suspects to recognize nerves when he saw them. Meanwhile, back at the Wallace home, the three brothers were bracing themselves for the outcome. Tyler paced the living room while Logan tried to reassure his father, who was slowly regaining strength in the hospital. Noah stayed quiet, his eyes fixed on the phone, waiting for Jennings to call. Then, hours later, the phone rang. Jennings' voice was steady. "We're not filing charges yet, but I need you to know the evidence points to your caregiver. The sedative wasn't an accident. It was introduced deliberately." The brothers sat in stunned silence. Months of doubt, suspicion, and whispered arguments were finally given shape. Someone they had trusted in their father's home had crossed a line. For Jennings, the case was far from over. He had evidence of poisoning, but not enough to prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Was this attempted murder, a financial scheme gone wrong, or a desperate act by someone overwhelmed with responsibility? For the Wallace family, one thing was certain. Life in their father's home would never be the same again.
The weeks following Richard Wallace's death were heavy with uncertainty. His sons, Tyler, Logan, and Noah, grew frustrated with the slow pace of the investigation. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. But more than anything, they wanted justice for their father. The toxicology report became the turning point. What initially looked like an elderly man's sudden decline was revealed to be the result of deliberate poisoning. The medical examiner confirmed that Richard's system contained traces of a strong sedative, administered in doses far higher than any doctor would prescribe. This was not negligence, it was intentional. Detectives dug deeper. Neighbors recalled seeing Amma purchasing cleaning products and chemicals unusual for regular caregiving. Bank records revealed that Amma had been quietly wiring money overseas, amounts far beyond what her modest salary could explain. And when investigators searched her small apartment, they found containers of the same sedatives discovered in Richard's system, hidden in a drawer. By January, detectives knew they had enough to make an arrest. It was a cold morning in Columbus, Ohio. Police vehicles slowly rolled up to Amma's apartment building. Detectives in heavy coats stepped out, their breath visible in the frigid air. The lead detective, Michael Graves, knocked firmly on the door. When Amma opened it, she looked startled, but not completely shocked. Inside, the officers read her rights. Neighbors peeked through their blinds as Amma was escorted down the steps in handcuffs, led into the back of a patrol car. The caregiver who once promised to look after Richard Wallace was now under arrest, accused of taking his life. Amma Boateng was officially charged with murder, elder abuse, and administering a harmful substance. The trial began 3 months later in Franklin County Court. Reporters filled the benches, drawn to the shocking story of a trusted caregiver turned killer. Prosecutors laid out a damning case. Richard Wallace, a vulnerable man dependent on Amma's care, had been systematically drugged. Financial records showed Amma benefiting as his health declined. Expert witnesses testified that the sedative levels in Richard's body were lethal. The Wallace brothers sat side by side in the courtroom, their faces heavy with grief. Tyler, the eldest, kept his hands folded tightly. Logan leaned forward, eyes fixed on the proceedings. Noah, the youngest, often wiped tears from his face, struggling to endure the testimony. Amma's defense team argued she was overwhelmed, that she never intended harm. But the evidence was too strong. The sedatives, the money transfers, the neglect, all pointed toward guilt. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated only 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman read the verdict aloud. On the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Amma Botang, guilty. Gasps filled the courtroom. Tyler placed a hand on Logan's shoulder while Tyler bowed his head, eyes closed in relief. For the first time in months, the brothers felt the scales of justice tip in their favor. Amma showed little emotion as the judge delivered the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck, sealing her fate. Outside the courthouse, the brothers spoke briefly to the press. Our father trusted her, Tyler said, his voice breaking. We trusted her, and she betrayed us all. Nothing can bring Dad back, but today, at least, justice was served. That night, the brothers gathered at their father's house. They lit candles around framed photos of Richard Wallace, smiling, laughing, holding his sons when they were children. For them, the trial did not erase the grief, but it gave them closure. Their father's suffering had not been ignored. His story had been heard. And the woman who chose to kill instead of care would spend the rest of her life behind bars.